BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
And now our new book of the week. Playwright and novelist Michael Frayn provides a unique view of himself as he is now. Among others, is adapted in 5 episodes by the author. The reader is Martin Jarvis.
This story begins, like the story of man in the Bible, with a fall. In this case, though, the man was just me, and the fall was painfully literal. I got up for a pee in the middle of the night and found myself not escorted out of Eden by God's security people, but lying on the hard tiled floor beside the lavatory with several broken ribs, and no idea how I'd arrived there. It started me thinking, as I got over the initial shock and all the tests and scans in the weeks that followed, about how old I seemed to have got all of a sudden. This was some years ago now. I've got a lot older since. About all the life that had led up to my being so old, and all the world around me that had shaped that life. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that I was the product of that world. You are what you eat, not just the food on your plate that you take in through your mouth and digest with your stomach. The whole world around you that you take in through your eyes and ears and digest with your brain. What would you be without it? Contentless. A camera with an unexposed film. A set of possibilities framed by your genetic inheritance, but never realized, as something unshaped and unformed. A nothing. You might make an environment out of very little. An orphan, cast away at birth on a desert island, would no doubt construct a self of some kind out of the wind and the surf, the bare rocks and the seabirds. How much richer and more formative his surroundings would become, though, when Man Friday arrives. More than anything else, surely, it's the other human beings in our lives who make us who we are. Each of them, for a start, is a life-size model of oneself, a picture of how one appears to the outside world, which is striking enough. But the second most noticeable thing about each of them is that it is not oneself, not a picture or a reflection. It's totally different, a genetically different set of possibilities, shaped by a different environment. One of the things that makes its environment different is that it contains a different selection of other people, each of whom has been shaped by yet another environment, and another selection of people that they, in their turn, have to deal with. There's something slightly comic about this in my case. One of the things that preoccupied me when I was a child was trying to make a man, or at least a dummy. Over and over again on wet afternoons, I would lay out clothes on the floor and fill them with cushions and towels, then make a head out of a pair of underpants stuffed with socks, and put a papier-mâché mask on the front of it. This is, more or less, how I have spent a lot of my professional life since, of course, making men and women, but out of words and sentences instead of cushions and socks. And all the time, I realise now I look back on it, I was being moulded into shape myself by the people around me. I started thinking about all these people who have made me what I am, for better or for worse, and this life of mine, what it has been. Some have had a profound effect, some a small and passing one. Some have had no real effect that I'm conscious of, but remain part of my mental fabric, because my recollection of them is, for some reason, so vivid. It was my parents, of course, who shaped the beginnings of my life, and I've written about them at some length already, together with some of the other people who shaped my childhood. But what about all the people I've come across since? All the tutors and lecturers who taught me? or my fellow students, who gave me such intriguing glimpses into their own subjects, architecture in particular, psychology, anthropology, the colleagues I've worked with, the editors who have improved my books, the producers, directors, and actors who have brought my plays to life, and all the other people I've had dealings with, who made me see things their way, or react against it, who coloured the bald outlines of the world around me, right or wrong, serious or ridiculous, agreeable or disagreeable. I seem to be a particularly influenceable subject, in fact, a natural lieutenant, always ready to follow people who are by nature leaders, always eager to be diverted by passing attractions. I should like to say a brief word about a few of these people who have made my world, and me with it, before my memory finally goes. My choice out of all the possible candidates is pretty capricious. One or two of my closest and most enduring friends, certainly, but not others more or less equally close and enduring. One or two people who left traces of themselves in the fictitious characters I invented professionally. One or two simply because the memory of them amused me. One or two for no good reason at all. There's one aspect of the selection that seems not so much capricious as weird. There are very few women in it. I should have expected some sort of disparity because there were so relatively few women in the sexually segregated world in which I grew up. An all-boys school followed by all-male military service. A university with, in those days, 9 men to every 1 woman. A job in a newspaper reporter's room where all my colleagues but one were men. The wonder, now I look back on it, is that I ever came into contact with any women at all. But of course I did, in spite of everything, and some of them marked my life at least as much as any of the men. My 3 daughters, for instance. But you can't write about your own children. My second wife. But you can't write about your own wife. Even with all the others, it seems to me, there's often a difficulty. A difference in gender is like a difference in electrical polarity. Not so, I know, for a lot of people, but I don't think I can ever quite escape an awareness of that difference. Always intriguing, however faint. The more likely the relationship is to have an effect on you, the less likely it is to resemble an ordinary friendship, and the more likely that slight intriguing tingle is to resemble the force that arcs between 2 thunderclouds. Ordinary friendships are open, and you can tell the world about them. Past friendships, present friendships. At the heart of a love affair, though, is surely something that can't be made public, while to talk about it without giving any account of that something seems an even worse betrayal. Then again, a love affair is exclusive. Former lovers or their later partners may not want to hear any reference made to the feelings of the past. You can have many friendships at the same time, and they can run on for years, become closer or more remote, be forgotten and renewed, fade quietly away. More than one love affair at a time, and there's trouble, and that single relationship either develops into a bond that ends only in death, or is broken off short in one painful way or another. But how old all the people in my life had got. A lot of us, in fact, even people the same age as me or younger, were already dead. More of us have died since. I think that this was one of the things that started me making sketches of some of them while I remained among the survivors. How long would that last, though? I was evidently more fragile than I'd supposed. And I started to think about the strange organism that all this performance depended upon. My own body. The book is entitled Among Others, because that's what it's about, the others in my life. But in the section called Mantar, which is what follows here, I've come back to where I started, to the person I've known best and longest in my life. And it's not really one of those others at all, it's myself, considered not as a person, though, but as a physical object. Your own body, after all, plays a leading part in the show, of which it's also the audience. It's not only the instrument of your consciousness, it's the source of a lot of what you're conscious of: pains and pleasures, information about its disposition in space, its approach to action, and its understanding of the results, the ever-present background to your waking world. You take it pretty much for granted, at any rate until something goes wrong, but it's a part of the environment at least as important in making you what you are as the people and things around you. What surprised me most about my midnight fall, now I'd begun to think about it objectively, was not so much that I'd fallen, but that I'd ever managed to remain upright. For nearly 80 years, a structure just over 6 feet high had balanced for a good part of each day on a base about 10 inches long by 4 inches wide at its widest. How long would David have stayed upright, exquisitely proportioned as he was, if Michelangelo had not fixed him to his plinth, or any of the other marble and bronze figures who stand about with such assurance in our cities? The ground would be strewn with horizontal kings and generals, with gods and mothers of gods, and all around them a detritus of detached marble heads and shattered limbs. Or think about it as architecture. If I'd been constructed to the same standards as a modern tower block, there would have been another foot or more of me concreted into the bathroom floor. To put it the other way round, if the high-rise buildings that now dominate the London skyline had been built to the same proportions as me, they would be not 50 floors high, or even 78 like the Shard, but something more like 100, postmodernist whimsies bulging outwards from their narrowest point, and plonked down on the bare earth without foundations. Somewhat fewer than 80 years, I think, would have elapsed before the wind had got up, or some passer-by had brushed against them. And if they'd had not only to stand still, but to move around, as I've spent my life doing, over ground full of potholes and curbs, groping their way out to the bathroom, half asleep in the dark. It's not the first time, of course, that this particular tower has fallen down. It fell down most often, curiously, in its early years, when it was still only half its present height, or less. But it's the first time it's done it since those early days, without any external cause to explain it. Ice underfoot, an unnoticed step, soap, or on one occasion my daughter's dog being chased by another dog. For nearly 80 years, a complex internal machinery has evidently been at work without my ever noticing it, sensing ground levels and wind speeds, motion forwards, backwards and sideways, estimating the turning moment of rucksacks and babes in arms, then finally adjusting muscle tensions to compensate. The world's rarest species in each of our lives. It's one single, none other. And it's just as mysterious as all the others.
Martin Jarvis was reading from Among Others by Michael Frayn. The director is Rosalind Ayres, and Among Others is a Jarvis and Ayres production.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
And now, Book of the Week. Among Others by Michael Frayn, adapted by the author. In the section entitled Man Tower, Michael considers that if he'd been constructed differently, he might not have had that fall in the bathroom. The reader is Martin Jarvis.
So, I'm a tower, and I'm looking down on myself from 100 floors up. From this height, perspective makes my feet look even smaller, about 1 inch long, I estimate, if I compare them with a ruler at eye level. Toy feet, piffling appendages. I've always had some faint apprehension of how hard the departments on the middle floors work, pumping away day and night, gasifying, detoxifying, digesting. I hadn't really thought about what was happening on the lower floors. Nothing much, I'd assumed, if one was standing still, but even here, I realise now, the staff are on duty, endlessly monitoring the information coming in from the nervous system about surrounding conditions, and doing whatever's necessary to adapt to them, until one day their efforts are brushed aside by a sudden surge of uncompensated gravity, as abruptly as democracy in a military putsch. No ice underfoot, no soap unnoticed. You simply go for a pee, just as you have so many times in your life before, and in the half-darkness of the urban night, and the half-conscious confusion of half-waking, the now elderly operatives downstairs are caught napping. I'm not the only one that this kind of thing happens to. Half of all the people of my age, according to NHS Direct, fall down at least once a year. My oldest friend told me, in the last few years of his life, that he fell down about once a week. And for many people, it has much worse results than a few broken ribs and a sudden awareness of how implausible the whole human arrangement is. It's the most common cause of death in older people. A surgeon told a friend of mine that rule number 1 for healthy living in old age was always hold on to the handrail when you're going downstairs. Better still might be to get a builder to bolt you to a plinth or cement you deep into the bedrock. You don't usually look down at the building below you from the boardroom windows up here on the top floor. What you see most of the time is all the other man-towers around you. About some of them you know considerably more than you do about yourself, not just what they look like round the front from head height, but seen from behind, seen from above, seen from ground level. With one of them at least, probably, you know what each inch of their fabric feels like to the touch. Then the overnight catastrophe happens, and when you've got yourself upright again, and daylight has returned, it occurs to you to open the window, lean out, and look down to see what's been going on below. 100 floors, and all occupied by the same firm. 100 trillion cells, as my cousin Keith Frayn, who's a biochemist, once worked out for me when I asked him, all labouring away at their own specialities, all organising and reorganising themselves in complex alliances and hierarchies. I'm the managing director of this great conglomerate, and I'm only now, after 80 years of almost unbroken good health, beginning to be surprised at the immense variety of activities and specialist skills for which I'm nominally responsible. I've never even noticed how much routine maintenance I've had to put into it. At each meal, according to usually reliable sources on the internet, I've taken in about 500 grams of food, a kilogram or so a day, and excreted about the same amount. So in the 30,000 days I've spent on this earth, about 30 tons of stuff have passed through my digestive system, which is equivalent to the weight of 7 elephants. 7 elephants in, 7 elephants out. I've apparently also drunk and passed about 1 litre of fluid a day. That's 30,000 litres, almost enough to fill a 20-metre swimming pool. I've also, of course, been breathing without cease 23,000 times a day. With each breath, I've extracted about 350 millilitres of air from the atmosphere and returned the same amount, so that in the course of my life I've apparently passed some 245 million litres of air through my lungs, enough to fill nearly 50 gas holders. Most of the architecture I'm looking down on seems elegantly fit for purpose. 2 legs, a very reasonable number. 1 less, and I should have had to hop everywhere, and would surely have suffered my great fall many years earlier. 3 or more, and I should have been faced with an endless succession of wearisome choices about which to step forward with next. 2 arms, also perfect, or how else should I have held a knife and fork, or opened a can of sardines? But the arbitrariness of some of the other features is odd. Why 10 fingers, for instance? Why 10 toes? All those nails to trim, when forefinger and thumb alone, and 2 feet without any appendages at all, would surely have been enough for most purposes. Halfway up the facade, if you happen to be male, there's one particularly weird anomaly. I realize that you've got to have a projecting feature of some sort if you're going to make sexual reproduction work, and maybe it's disconcertingly wild variations in length and flexibility from a floppy half-inch at one moment to, at the next, a steel-reinforced tower in its own right, a dozen or so times as long, may be necessary to combine function and security, though why we up here on the top floor have so dismayingly little control over these variations is hard to understand. But what in heaven's name is going on with the sighting of the testicles? How can something so essential to the survival of the species, so easily injured and so sensitive to pain, have been left by evolution dangling outside the fortifications? I look down from the boardroom and am astonished, now I see them with fresh eyes, to realize that the kind of thing most companies keep in a safe, the personal details of the staff, and the plans for future development, this company keeps in a bag suspended outside the windows of the 49th floor, knowing that if anyone handles it roughly, the window cleaners say, bashing it against their cradle, the whole building is going to jackknife in agony. Nothing I can do now to correct this extraordinary freak of natural selection, but draw a veil of protective trousering over it. But how did accidents and the competition of rivals not haul such a hostage to so many different aspects of fortune back into the safety of the building millions of years before trousers were even invented? What I start to notice next are the small private variations from the norm that make this particular body personal to me. Some of them they're from birth, some acquired over the next 80 years. My feet, to start with, the devices that so improbably keep the whole structure upright. Even more improbably in my case, because mine are seriously defective. They pronate. The soles slope up towards the centre, so that the actual load-bearing area of each one is even smaller than it should be. By my calculation, they carry the best part of twice the weight per square inch of the most implausibly balanced creature I can think of in the rest of the natural world. A big bird, like a goose, say, with one leg tucked up beneath it, standing on the other to rest. There's another problem, too. My feet aren't level with each other because my left leg is shorter than my right, so that if my body weren't somehow taking up the slack, the whole skyscraper would be as way out of plumb as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Now think of those unanchored high rises tottering around London in the dark, not only without foundations, but balanced on a ground floor that was several % out of the horizontal. So skillfully does the body compensate for even such gross discrepancies as this, though, that in my case 60 years went by before anyone noticed. On top of my right foot, still just visible in a slanting evening light, is my one extant scar, the last trace of a hot summer afternoon some 75 years ago, when I was running round in and out of the freezing spray from a garden hose in a friend's garden, and fell over the prong of an upturned garden fork. There would be a lot of other scars all over me, marking the history of my life, if the body were not as adept at concealing lesions as the earth at burying old wars. If I'd made a time-lapse film of all the scratches, bruises, spots, boils and rashes that have come and gone on my skin over the last 80 years, all the holes made by pins, splinters, thorns and insects, by needles extracting blood or injecting vaccines, it would look like soup simmering. Other battles, largely invisible to the rest of the world, have been fought beneath the surface. Ferocious skirmishing at various times up and down my digestive tract. A major local war in my lower back, which broke out with bewildering suddenness on Tuesday, December 14, 1976, during a game of squash, and continued through an era of intermittent strife as long as the 30 Years' War, subsiding, though fighting still flares up from time to time, only when the irregularities in the length of my legs and the level of the soles of my feet were discovered, and orthotics prescribed to correct them. Most of these problems had explicable causes. Some of the other anomalies and irregularities are baffling, and it's difficult to know whether they're personal idiosyncrasies or the kind of thing that everyone suffers from. On my upper left thigh is a bit of me that seems to have died several decades prematurely, a patch of skin without feeling, as if it had been injected by the dentist with Novocaine, as alien to me as the insensate leg that Oliver Sacks's patient tried to throw out of bed. Then, in the area above my coccyx, for the last 10 years or so, I've had an itch, with no visible cause. Long, irregular scratches appear quite frequently higher up my back, on and between my shoulder blades, as mysteriously as crop circles. Much more tedious are the cramps that so often in the night seize various parts of my legs like a torturer's pincers. The worst are in the big muscles of the thigh, the second worst in the calf. I hurl myself out of bed with amazing speed, because the only treatment is to load one's full weight onto the affected leg. In my haste, my feet get tangled in the bedclothes. It's surprising that no ribs have so far got broken like this, and the few seconds' delay make me wonder once again how anyone ever endures serious lasting pain. Sometimes the lightning strikes my toes or my fingers. A new development is cramp in my shins. This isn't so painful, perhaps because there are surely no muscles in your shins to get cramped. But since, by the same token, there are none to get uncramped, it's harder to get rid of. Do other people bite their own tongue as often as I do when they eat? Odd, if so. You'd think that if we'd managed to evolve ways of differentiating between food and tongue at all, as we seem to have done, then evolution would by now have perfected them, because being suddenly unable to eat or speak in the middle of a meal would surely have reduced an individual's probability of survival, or at least of attracting sexual partners. And I choke almost as readily as I breathe. I choke on toast, pepper, vinaigrette, water, any food, any drink, my own saliva, a mouthful of air. Air is particularly dangerous. Choking often leads to sneezing at the same time. It's surprising that I haven't choked or sneezed to death a long time before this falling over business began.
Martin Jarvis was reading from Among Others by Michael Frayn. The director is Rosalind Ayres, and Among Others is a Jarvis and Ayres production.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
And now, Book of the Week. Among Others by Michael Frayn, adapted by the author. In episode 3, Martin Jarvis continues his reading from the section entitled Man Tower.
Difficult to know what's going on in the inner chambers of this tower that constitutes me, except by inference from vague sensations and external symptoms. I've had 2 rare direct glimpses, though, when the doctors put a television camera up my behind to check the state of my colon. Alan Bennett, in the wonderful section of Untold Tales about his own experiences in the lower intestine, says he was given Valium, and he rather enjoyed its effects. I don't recall any drugs, but I was kept entertained, like a bored child, by being allowed to watch television, the live broadcast from the camera as it tracked further and further into the depths of me. 7 elephant loads of material had passed this way over the years, but there was no sign of this prodigious industry in the travelogue from my colon, since the whole thing had been cleared out first by an enema, like a factory being smartened up for a royal visit. On and on the camera went, its headlight illuminating nothing but more and more soft, moist pink cavern, yard after yard, mile after mile, until my interest waned, and the investigators with it. A floor or 2 up, and we come to the firm's central pumping and oxygenation unit, through which the 50 gas holders of air have come and gone. I'm not sure I'd want a tour here, even if it were possible. I've never liked to think about my heart beating, or the blood going round. in case self-consciousness made me suddenly lose the trick, rather as my fingers sometimes find, if I stop to think about it, that they've forgotten which keys to press to enter my PIN or open the garden gate. There's another little oddity in the functioning of my lungs. 15 breaths a minute for all these years, something over 6 billion breaths in all, and most of them I've scarcely noticed. Very occasionally, though, I think when I return to my conscious self, after I've been lost in thought for a while, I found myself taking a single, much deeper one. I imagine there's a perfectly plausible physical explanation for this. My breathing had probably slowed while I was abstracted, and once normal service was resumed, the body was calling for extra oxygen. That deep breath, though, always has a slightly wistful feel, like a sigh, as if I were reluctant to abandon my reverie and face the everyday world again. Is this part of the human condition, or is it yet another mad idiosyncrasy of my own? A year or two ago, I noticed that the pattern had changed. I'd begun to take these deep breaths much more frequently, perhaps once every 5 or 10 minutes. An occasional trip to the land of faerie, followed by emergency oxygen, may or may not be normal, but it's happening every 5 or 10 minutes surely can't be. And now my breathing seems to have reverted to what it was before, which is just as weird, though perhaps a good thing, unless it means that I'm simply thinking less. So we come to my head, the part of me which is conducting this examination. It's also the part that the rest of the world has always known best, at any rate the front of it, my face. It's my identity card, me for most everyday purposes. Also the running newscast that signals, consciously or unconsciously, truthfully or with intent to deceive, what mood I'm in and what I think about the person I'm talking to. Do other people see the same familiar face that I see myself in reflections and photographs? Not at all. What I see is someone who knows he's being inspected. What they see, most of the time, is the face that I sometimes catch a glimpse of in a photograph that I didn't know was being taken, or in a reflection that I for a moment didn't realize was a reflection. Someone who's disconcertingly like me, but not me as I know me. I usually recognize him when I come across him, of course, since I've met him quite often over the years, but in the way that I might recognize any other rather distant acquaintance. The discrepancy between my reflection and my photograph is particularly marked in my case, because my face, like my shoulders and the length of my legs, is cut on the slant. I don't notice the anomaly until I see a photograph of myself where the deviation from the norm that I'm so familiar with in the reflected image is turned back to front. Maybe other people don't notice it so much either, since they've probably never looked me in the mirror. I find it a bit embarrassing, but also touching, because I've seen it before, in an old portrait of my maternal grandmother. My nose, in the middle of all this, is unremarkable, except that it runs all the time. When I'm choking, coughing and sneezing, certainly, but even when I'm not. Why? Old men's noses just do, said the friend who fell down a lot, though his didn't, and mine always has, even when it belonged to a younger man, to a boy even, when I had various holes drilled inside it as storm drains, which all closed up again almost immediately. What a nose, able to withstand any punishment the doctors could inflict upon it. On it ran, and runs, and no doubt ever will. Run and run, longer than any of my plays, longer even than the mousetrap. My ears now have little hearing aids tucked behind them, and I still find it hard to make sense of what emerges from them. I can't understand films or plays in the few foreign languages I'm supposed to know, nor American ones, for that matter, nor often British ones. But then I can't understand much of what people say in any language, even when they're not half a mile away on a stage or expressing themselves in cryptic neologisms on the screen. Is this the failing of my ears or my brain? The organs I'm using now, of course, as I look down at myself from the top of the building that is me, are my eyes. They've never been good, though, and my astigmatism, invisible in itself, has had a greater effect on my appearance over the years than all my other bodily defects and accidents put together. The clumsy constructions I've had to wear to keep two therapeutically distorting windows between me and the world have seemed to characterize me. As soon as I got my first pair of specs, when I was 6, the little Amazon who ran the gang that assembled in the shrubbery at school every break identified me as what was then called a boffin, and appointed me gang scientist, with the task of producing weapons of mass destruction. Complete strangers have sometimes since addressed me as Doctor. When they see my specs on the author photograph in a theatre programme, or inside the back flap of a book, people are readier to believe that I do actually know something about subjects like physics or philosophy. I look at myself in old photographs, and there, in the changing shape of my spectacles alone, my biography is written. In childhood, the lenses are small and round, in wire frames. As I grow taller, the diameter of the lenses increases to match. The disapproving condescension of adolescence is framed in serious tortoiseshell, the light-heartedness of being an undergraduate by transparent plastic. As I leave university and start work, the top of the frame becomes opaque, as if attempting a first frown of dawning responsibility. I begin appearing on television, and for a while the frames are huge and horn-rimmed with self-importance to keep up with all the other ambitious young men of the time. I settle down to marriage and family, and the frames of my spectacles become transparent again. Then they go silver. I don't know what that signifies. These days they've become even more understated, and I like to think that the unframed lenses say nothing about me at all. Himmler and Dr. Crippen probably thought the same. Then I have my cataracts done, and even the lenses go, so that I change yet again, and even more thoroughly. After the old friend who fell down a lot had his cataracts removed and gave up spectacles, it took me months to feel I actually knew the stranger he had become. My vision is effectively closed down completely from time to time, without apparent cause or warning, by a swirling fairground of coloured lights, which I think must be the aura that migraine sufferers describe, though not, thank God, the headaches and nausea that they endure as well. Flickering illuminated wheels seem to revolve and interlock, without ever quite becoming resolved as specific images, and I have to stop working or reading or driving until the whole circus has packed up and moved out of town as silently and mysteriously as it arrived. Just me, this? Or something as common as the common cold? Hidden somewhere beneath the surface, here is the most mysterious and elusive of all my body parts, the concealed control centre which is directing and coordinating everything that's happening, or has ever happened, around it and on the floors below. It's conducting this survey. It's thinking these thoughts, this very one now, and directing my fingers to write these lines, this very sentence in which I'm saying it is. Or so I believe. I have no direct evidence of its existence, no proprioception of it, in the way that I do of so many other parts of my body. An occasional headache over the years has suggested that there's something going on in there, but what it told me is even more oblique than what a stomachache tells me about the functioning of my digestive system. The little that I know about it I infer from the actions that my hands, feet, and vocal cords undertake at its behest, and from the existence of a world around me that I know I can be aware of only if I have some very sophisticated piece of equipment somehow translating and integrating certain vibrations in the light and in the air, certain aspects of the local chemistry. And yet it is in this unreachable, unknowable inner chamber that I instinctively feel my real self to be located. Perhaps this is simply because of its proximity to my eyes and ears. If these were in my feet instead of my head, things might be different. For a start, my feet would appear to me to be large, and my body would taper away upwards to the insignificant and apparently functionless protrusion on my shoulders, only an inch or two long. I should know all about the ground I walked on, be on familiar terms with worms and beetles, be more deft at avoiding puddles and dog shit. I should study every slightest change in the expression of the other feet around me. If we all had our mouths down here as well, we should kiss and whisper together at ground level and never drop food down our shirt fronts. My feet would be me. But as it is, up here is where I am, looking down over the 100 floors beneath me. Or am I? Is this invisible processor behind my eyes really me?
Martin Jarvis was reading from Among Others by Michael Frayn. The director is Rosalind Ayres, and Among Others is a Jarvis and Ayres production.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
And now episode 4 of our Book of the Week, Among Others by Michael Frayn. In the section called Mantower, Michael continues an examination of his own identity. The reader is Martin Jarvis.
A body often continues to live on after parts of the brain have died, even after what seems to be every consciousness-bearing aspect of it has failed. And we are inclined to continue treating it as the whole person it once was. But do we feel that a body that has never had a functioning brain, that was born without one, really constitutes a self? That it's a person? We don't know quite what to say. This is the puzzle at the heart of Peter Nichols's play, A Day in the Death of Joe Egg, where the father cannot feel that his brain-dead child is a human being in any sense that makes a practical moral or social claim upon others, while the mother, who actually brought it forth into the world, cannot but. Then again, I could lose quite a lot of my body and still feel I was me. In exceptional cases, brains seem capable of supporting a sense of the self, even when all possibility of expressing their function through perception and movement has gone. Or at any rate, they seem capable of continuing to do so after the connection with the rest of the body has been lost. Can one imagine, though, that a brain could offer any sense of self or identity if it was the converse of Joe Egg, if it had never had a body and sense organs to provide it with information? This is what makes it so difficult to see how artificial intelligence can ever replicate animal intelligence. However you set up a system external to the body, it can only do what it's been told to do, unless it can also feel for itself, unless it can suffer from doing this and take pleasure in doing that, unless it can experience the various urges that drive us as animals to find fuel and to avoid danger, to survive and to reproduce ourselves before we wear out and cease to function, unless it can fear and desire. All these mechanisms were developed in us by the logic of evolution, because they give us a competitive edge over the inanimate and the insensate. And for all of them, The services provided by the 100 lower floors are as essential as the department on the top floor that processes the information. Here's what I'm starting to think, as I look down at my body and its history, that I'm the whole of me, that this body of mine isn't something that simply belongs to me, the logistical support system for my brain, necessary no doubt, but something external to the core of my real self. It is me, just as much as the belatedly curious head examining it. My identity runs through and through the structure, like Blackpool through the rock, or the image through the hologram. I suppose I've always known this, but there's a difference between knowing something without thinking about it, as one knows what country one's in, say, and knowing it consciously at this very moment, like a fresh discovery. Still, when it comes to knowing something, which is what I'm trying to do about my various scars and spots in this survey, then it's true that my brain is where the knowing is going on. What, with no ability to sense itself, does it know about its own adventures and malfunctions? Well, some of its shortcomings are made manifest in performance. Mine has never really lived up to the character that the specs have seemed to suggest. I've usually been one of the least clever in any group I've been part of. Memory has always been a particular weakness, and now, of course, it's getting steadily worse. Each day, says Wikipedia, 100,000 brain cells die. So, in my 30,000 days on Earth, the best part of 3 billion have gone, bearing off, first of all, people's names, followed by the names of places, books, plays, films, and eventually everything else in the world. Everyone has difficulties here, of course. Names seem to be stored in a separate department from the rest of one's language, a room open to the elements on all sides, out of which the right names scatter like dead leaves in the autumn wind, and into which the wrong names sometimes drift to replace them. Numbers, too, are in some store where security is particularly lax. The pin for my bank card, lodged so firmly most of the time that it enters itself on the little buttons in front of me without my thinking about it, sometimes turns out to have departed for a short holiday. The queue at the checkout waits while I look it up on my phone, where I keep it safely protected by a rather ingenious code, which turns out, of course, as I stand there with everyone watching, to be away from its desk as well. Worse, the other day I turned on the radio and identified the Beethoven symphony they were playing, which was as familiar as the back of my hand, as the fourth, when in fact it was the third, which is totally different. Soon I shall be looking at the back of my hand itself and failing to know whether it's a hand or a foot. Then I had an even odder and more disturbing episode. For half an hour or so, my problem with names spread to the rest of the language, to common nouns as well as proper ones, to verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. I was in a meeting about a professional matter, and suddenly found, to my dismay, that I couldn't remember the words for what I wanted to say, or locate the meanings that should have been attached to the words that other people were uttering. It was as if English had suddenly become a foreign language, and one that I had only a very poor grasp of. I was shaken. What had happened, I wondered afterwards, when I'd got out of the meeting and normal service seemed to have been resumed? What had caused the problem? Maybe there wasn't a cause in any usual sense of the word, any more than there seems to be for biting my tongue. Perhaps the whole event was random. I'd got confused because I'd got confused. There have been many episodes in the course of my life when I've behaved in some odd and often embarrassing way for which I could later offer no explanation. Once, years ago, when I had about 2 billion more brain cells than I have now, I heard myself claim, in the course of conversation, to have been born in New York, when in fact I was born in London, and do it not as a joke or an attempt to deceive, but because I thought it was true. A few years ago, still with about 30 million more brain cells than now, I drove round a roundabout that I had used 1,000 times before, and, not distracted, not daydreaming, thinking about what I was doing, drove straight past the exit I meant to take. Scarcely able to believe what I'd done, and now concentrating even harder on getting it right, I continued round the roundabout to have another go, and found myself turning off 2 exits before the right one, so that I was heading back the way I'd come, in precisely the opposite direction to the way I wanted to go, and into an inescapable rush-hour jam. Why did I do these things? I don't know. I just did them. They did themselves. Why had I fallen over in the bathroom? I hadn't tripped or slipped. I just lost my balance, after all those years of keeping it. As I nursed my broken ribs next day, though, I recalled the meeting where English had become a foreign language, and it occurred to me with a sudden dismal certainty that these two apparently dissimilar events had something in common, that they both did have an identifiable cause, and that the cause was right here on the top floor of the building, the man tower that seems to be me. Which is why I made an appointment with the doctor. In the course of the next week or two, I had more contact with the NHS than I've had since it was founded, in the teeth of our then family doctor's opposition. First, the 4 different GPs, who happened to be available on the 4 different occasions I went to the surgery. Then 2 local hospitals, where between them I had 2 electrocardiograms, 2 brain scans, 1 arterial scan, and a 24-hour heart monitor. I gave specimens of my blood and my urine, and registered 3 different pulse rates and 4 different blood pressures. I was seen by a cardiologist, a neurologist, and 6 radiologists, and I was prescribed 3 different sorts of pill. I have to say I rather enjoyed most of it. There are a lot of amazingly nice people in the NHS. One of the 2 hospitals I went to had just been in the news, it's true, because a patient had starved to death unnoticed. But the prospects for outpatients like myself seemed to be rather more hopeful. Everything appeared to be clean. Everything was running on time. The paperwork flying back and forth between so many different departments occasionally went astray, but everyone was very friendly. The doctors explained patiently what they were going to do, and then what the result was. There was quite a lot of laughter, one way and another. But yes, my guess was right. I'd had a small stroke, a so-called silent one, with no immediately detectable symptoms. It suggests, though, that I might have more, and perhaps in future ones that are not so quiet and self-effacing. I'm dismayed, of course, most of all to find that something I'd always taken so much for granted about myself, being fundamentally healthy, is no longer true. I've become one of the aged sick who are overburdening the health service and causing such problems to our fellow citizens. In the past, I've always been a rather uninvolved member of the audience at organ recitals, as someone called the conversations that people of my age so often have, exchanging symptoms and comparing treatments. There was an evening, not so long ago, when everyone around the dinner table, some my age, some younger, compared notes on how many different sorts of pill they were now taking each day. I was a little embarrassed at the sparseness of my own tally. 0. Embarrassed, but also secretly rather proud that I was costing the country so little. If you happen to be healthy, it's difficult not to ascribe it privately to your own good sense and right thinking. Pride. I should have remembered what it goes before. For me, my own fall signified more than pride humbled. It also had something of the biblical connotation. I have lost my medical innocence. The gates of Eden are closed behind me, not by cherubim with a flaming sword, by the big pharmaceutical companies, with 3 different sorts of pill to be taken every evening for the rest of my life, with more varieties for the morning to come later. One of them requires me to change my whole way of being. No more grapefruit. Grapefruit has been left behind, like the fruit that made Adam and Eve as gods, knowing good and evil. I miss its tart deliciousness as much as they must have done the power of moral discrimination.
Martin Jarvis was reading from Among Others by Michael Frayn. The director is Rosalind Ayres, and Among Others is a Jarvis and Ayres production.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
And now the final episode of our Book of the Week, Among Others. In the section entitled Man Tower, playwright and novelist Michael Frayn concludes his unique survey of himself. The reader is Martin Jarvis.
3 different sorts of pill, then, and more to come. I look down from the boardroom on the top floor of the Man Tower, that seems to be me, at those 100 floors below, and what I see now is a building kept upright only by a dreary scaffolding of pharmacology. But then it was never quite as structurally sound as I thought, I realise, now I've made this survey. It's like the countryside, so green and peaceful as you look out over it on a summer's day, but a moment's thought, and you realise that it's kept that way only by hard, underpaid agricultural labour, only by fertilisers and pesticides, only by bitter disputes in the local planning office, and every inch of it concealing a history of tribal conflict and civil wars, of Viking raids and rick burnings, of brutal enclosures and foreclosures. I suppose it's a hopeful lesson, on the whole, of how in time the grass will grow over almost anything. I should be grateful, in any case, to be alive, when so many of my friends and contemporaries no longer are, to have had so little pain and handicap when others have had so much, and to have had those various pills invented and produced, which will perhaps keep me going for a bit longer. All the same, I can't help being a little dismayed as I look out over the apparent peace of the now autumnal countryside, to find the greensward erupting and armed warriors rising from their graves to hack at each other once again. So, there's been some kind of a raid on my already greatly depleted stock of brain cells. What had I been keeping in them? It's always difficult to identify an absence rather than a presence. Who's missing from your birthday party? What was in the desk drawer before the burglars came? You may not remember until months later when you meet your absent guest in the street, or at last need your little silver penknife. What am I missing in this case? All those names, of course, the genders of about 30,000 German nouns, the things my wife says she's told me that I have no recollection of having heard. Most of them were probably gone or going before this new break-in. Perhaps it was the identities of Beethoven's symphonies. They were there until recently, weren't they? I was alarmed once again the other day when my wife pointed out, remarkably calmly, that I was driving on the right-hand side of the road instead of the left. We were in Berkshire at the time. Did I somehow think I was in the Lot-et-Garonne? I can't remember thinking anything in particular, or indeed thinking anything at all. I just did it. Mistakes like these about knowledge so simple and so taken for granted, such as which country one's in that one normally doesn't even think of it as knowledge, are particularly unsettling. Someone I know who is only a little older than me has taken to stopping at green lights and driving through red ones. We had another friend whose demented last days were overlaid by a mysterious stench in the sick room because, as his wife finally discovered, he had somehow forgotten the difference between a lavatory and a linen basket. Perhaps one of the things in that hole in my brain was an ability that for 80 years I'd never even noticed that I had, to stay upright in the dark. The burglars are going to come back. perhaps with sledgehammers this time, smashing down the front door and stripping the house in one massive organised assault, or slipping quietly into empty rooms while my back's turned, taking a spoon here and a vase there, so that I never quite realise what's going on. There's a lot to take. My whole life distributed around unmarked drawers, dumped in old grocery bags and dusty cupboards. 80 years of accumulated possessions. My entire sense of being the person I am. Even if anything remains after the burglars have finished, it will be incinerated when the whole house is finally shut down. This terminal brainlessness seems to me likely to cause problems to people who have made arrangements, as they believe, to inherit eternal life. There's surely a bit of a contradiction in the doctrine, anyway. Christ himself was very specific about the qualifications for the bequest. You had to obey the commandments, give all you possess to the poor, and follow him. A great many of his supposed followers, however, have not only balked at the second condition, but have insisted that if you fail the test, you're going to inherit eternal life anyway, be condemned to it, in fact, whether you like it or not, so that you can serve an eternal life sentence in some kind of divine penal institution. Even if the contractual arrangements you made with such forethought and self-sacrifice have worked out as you hoped, though, and you get the long holiday you've paid the deposit on, problems surely remain. "Welcome," says the tour company's representative with genuine warmth when you arrive, her pen hovering over the list of eternity makers. "And you are?" "Yes. Who are you?" "You've no idea. Names and all that kind of thing were stored in your brain, which is now reduced to ash and is fertilizing a rose bush in some municipal garden of remembrance." "No worries, pet," says the rep. "If you've forgotten your username or password, all you need to do is answer these few simple questions. Mother's maiden name? Make of first car you owned?" It's all gone, though. Everything you ever were. Every trace of what makes you who you are. You can't even hear the questions or see who's asking them, because your ears and eyes are under the rosebush with everything else. But at least you're not suddenly going to find your non-existent head down level with your non-existent feet, and suffer cracks in your non-existent ribs. And yet I do believe in eternal life. How long is eternity, after all? This is a question with which cosmologists struggle, or give up as impossible to answer in scientific terms. Is it the lifespan of the universe in which we live, and which began, as we now believe, at one very specific moment, 13-odd billion years ago? Or was there, in some sense, a time before this, in which nothing was, or in which there were other universes, and before which there was, what, still earlier universes? And will there be a time after it or they end? For me, though, and for you, the question is much simpler, because for each of us, eternity is rather clearly defined. Time began for me when I was born and first brought the universe into being by reading shapes and similarities into it, by learning the identities and the attributes that others had allotted to them. Time and the universe will end for me when I close my eyes for the last time, and the contents of my brain are cleared. I can project my imagination back, certainly, to what happened before I was born, and forwards to what will happen after I'm dead. But the life that I lend in this way to before and after lasts only as long as I have imagination to lend it. So, for me, my own lifespan and the lifespan of the universe are coterminous, as yours and it are for you. When I die, I shall have lived out my eternity. I shall have enjoyed eternal life, and when you die, so will you. Never mind the future perfect, though. The present tense is enough. I not only shall have enjoyed it, I am and you are enjoying it now, with as much of our brains and our senses as we can still muster. So, I shall never be dead, not in my lifetime. I shall live, and then and then, yes, move seamlessly from the present tense to the future perfect, shall have lived, though I shall never know it. What I shall have to find the courage to endure is not death, but the approaches to it, which is likely to be test enough. The deaths I do experience are the deaths of others. The longer I live myself, the more of them there are. My oldest friend has died even since I began to write these remarks. The deaths of some of those still living are too painful to be contemplated, too unbearable to identify, or be given the currency of words. I'm thankful, though, that there is at any rate one person in the world considerate enough to spare my feelings. I shall never give myself cause for grief. Never shall I have to get out my well-worn black tie in my own behalf. Never shall I have to worry about who to ask to speak at my funeral, or how many people refreshments need to be provided for. No aching emptiness for me in the nights that follow. No guilt or mean, secret, sneaking satisfaction to have survived when someone else hasn't. It's other people who will suffer the pain and trouble. Let me take this opportunity to apologize to them all in advance. So, eternal life. And yet I can't help feeling a touch of sadness that eternity will end, even if I'm not here to experience it. A few scratches and breakages notwithstanding, a few griefs and desolations apart, this 80-odd-year eternity of mine has been, as tour operators say, the journey of a lifetime. All those tests and scans and electrodes, all that time expended by doctors and specialists, are justified by finding the traces of that small silent stroke that I seem to have had. But now here's the little ironic twist at the end of the story. Whenever the stroke occurred, the neurologist doesn't think it was what caused the fall that set this whole investigation in motion. Nor, for that matter, the confusion with language that made me query the fall. It's pure coincidence. Two pure coincidences. One too many for any properly constructed story. What did cause those two events, then? We shall never know, says the neurologist. But if they hadn't happened, the doctors wouldn't have looked for the cause. And if they hadn't looked for the cause, they wouldn't have found the hole and prescribed the pills which may help to preserve me for a little longer yet. So that was the happy ending to the story of my fall. Except that it wasn't an ending, really, because time has passed since I wrote the earlier part of this essay, and with it, unbelievably, first my 80th birthday, and then 9 more. Other troubles have come and gone. A few more falls, a few more pains to investigate, another train of X-rays and scans, another televised visit to my intestines that I thought I should never see again, more electrodes attached to my chest, this time for longer, long enough to have detected an atrial fibrillation, an irregularity in my heartbeat that could encourage the formation of a clot in my blood and raises the chances of another stroke. So the anticoagulant I was prescribed has been replaced by a stronger one. The 3 pills every evening have been joined by 5 every morning. Various bits of new hardware have been installed in and around my heart. I suppose this is going to be the pattern of life from now on. More and more pains and malfunctions, more and more investigations, more and more pills. But there it all is, for the moment. Me, from head to toe. So, while it lasts, a moment of celebration. Brain, I embrace you. Belly, heart, pancreas, those tiny feet down there, you too. Scars, anomalies, malfunctions, a lot. Or rather, we all together salute ourselves.
Martin Jarvis was reading the final episode of Among Others by Michael Frayn, adapted by the author. The director is Rosalind Ayres, and Among Others is a Jarvis and Ayres production.